All right, please exclusively offer POIs in the chat. I do not think it should be debatable that Stephen buying a fancy bottle of wine is a lot less important than people from developing circuits in poor communities being able to afford competitions. I'm going to start by characterizing what for-profit debating looks like and then talk about two main things. Firstly, about inequality of opportunity in the coaching market, and then secondly, about accessibility toward competitions. What is for-profit debating? I think it is assumed two primary features. The first is a coaching market, particularly targeting schoolies, where they regularly pay like $200 an hour for a coach, and this coaching is sometimes infiltrating into the university level as well. But secondly, the generation of surplus profits from tournaments, where they tend to charge reg fee. Obviously, some goes to student IAs, but they're making quite a lot of money from that as well. I just want to start by characterizing that IAs are still obviously going to be paid. First, you can still have like some reg fees, albeit a lot lower, where some of that money still goes to IAs. But secondly, insofar as like the university is no longer profiting, a larger proportion of the low reg fees that you're making are going to go toward IA payments rather than going toward profits. We also find to bite the bullet of them being paid slightly less as well. Firstly, on inequality of opportunity in the coaching market. Right now, what the schooling market literally looks like are kids paying like $200 an hour for private coaches, and this is just proliferating a lot throughout like high school people. The reason why this is a bad thing is that it obviously rewards families who are rich and only people whose parents are able to afford it. Now, an obvious response to this is, now there's all these like EUDC online lectures and stuff like that. This is insufficient for two reasons. I think the first is that the push to get collective resources for people to learn from would have probably happened a couple decades ago when you wouldn't have had the proliferation of the market, because it would have just been a higher demand for these resources rather than relying on private coaches. Meaning that I think that it's a little bit too late, where a lot of inequalities have already been created, where certain communities and certain circuits have fallen behind due to inequalities of resources, whereas if you would have got the publicization of these things a lot earlier, you would have solved a lot of the inequalities happening in the first place. But secondly, having access to like an online thing is just a lot less valuable than having a fancy person who's going to literally write out your cases for you, literally do your case files, analyze in detail all of your speeches for you. This is still a significant leg up relative towards your competition. In terms of why the price is so high and why competition is insufficient is firstly, a lot of parents are just quite like desperate and therefore can very easily be extorted, given that this is just seen as being a vehicle to get their kids into like Ivy League school institutions. But secondly, competition just doesn't really work. I think a lot of the academy collude to keep their prices relatively high. So that's why they all just charge kids a lot. A lot of them, there isn't perfect competition because a lot of the time in your community, you have like one major academy or one major online one that often operates within your time zone. But when you form like personal connections and ties with the academy, they know that you're probably not going to leave because you have a coach that you resonate with. And if they basically price extort you, like I know they literally sometimes charge like $300 an hour for like, and even if not that much, like you're regularly paying $100+ an hour. What are the issues with this? Firstly, I just think it is inherently unfair that you get better at debate just because your parents have a lot of money. I think it is just better to reward people who are working really hard rather than just to reward richness. Secondly, more importantly though, it just distorts the demographic divide over who gets into debate and who succeeds in the first place, both on like the circuit-wide level and on the countrywide level as well. Just like more privileged white communities in the West, you can afford coaching, end up getting a massive leg up, meaning that like national teams at the schooly level end up just being dominated by like richer areas because they have the coaching to a much larger extent, but the ethnic majority within their respective states, and it's just advantage the Western circuit overall. I think that the reason why this is bad is that you just get fewer minority when you have fewer minorities in debate. So when you have like just fewer people from a collective group, it's likely to worsen discrimination that these people experience because they're seen as being outcasts and like outliers. You got less kind of unionization to push for rights when there were just fewer people who could do this, making them more individually vulnerable, and it's making minorities who opt into debate feeling like they have less of a support system overall. I just think that to weigh this off briefly against like coaches getting more money, like firstly, it's just like often successful people and the money is concentrated at the top rather than being distributed throughout the coaching market. There's other part-time jobs that they could work, and the number of parents and kids get exploited is just a lot larger. Our second argument is about access to competitions, both internally and between circuits. So internally, I think that for-profit debating has meant that the like cost for competitions to speak out as a speaker and even things like judge fees are just substantially higher, because given that there's a norm in favor of you were allowed to create a profit, it's seen as being justified to charge people beyond what food and IEs are going to cost. Red waivers are insufficient because number one, there's often only a limited number per tournament. Number two, a lot of people feel internal stigma toward accessing a lot of these things. Note that a lot of flat costs like IA payments small amounts of food are very low when distributed across a large number of people. So maybe it's like 5 or 10 quid to speak rather than 40 quid, which I'm pretty sure how much Doxbridge costs per person. Note that even if you don't think that the price itself is the expensive also creates perceptions of of elitism as well. When people just generally believe that it is very financially inaccessible. Why is this a bad thing? Firstly, just like a lot of college students who are not the most well off, who are lower middle class or middle class, just lose a lot of income debate because paying their rent every day, not having to work things, money to be able to afford things like food on a consistent basis, or just have better uses of money within their own life. I think that secondly, though, this rewards large schools who have more money to be able to send people to comms in the first place, which fuel the dominance of larger schools like Oxford and Cambridge historically, because they just subsidize the reg fee of all comms at the expense of smaller institutions who could keep up with the meta less and who got a lot less training because they're only able to spend a way lower number of money on institutions. Note that the most privileged institutions often coalesce along things like socioeconomic lines as well, entrenching a lot more elitism in debating, but they already just like locks out poor people in debate who genuinely cannot afford the activity. I think this is bad because a lot of these people could be ready debate and now feel less able to access it because they are poor. Before I talk about the second subpoint here, I'll take back half.
This is not a POI, this is a clarification. Can you clarify what the timeline of this looks like? And also you haven't taken a POI.
Top half?
Same thing.
I'm confused. That was a little bit glitchy in terms of like the timeline of just like, I think that the trend happened a long time ago when it came to reg fees, maybe in the last like 20-ish years with the coaching market. This just would have stopped notifying more resources earlier. In terms of things like between competitions, I think that an issue that exists is that some competitions are for profit and some competitions are not. So like in the same weekend that Doxbridge happening, there can be competitions from other circuits that aren't trying to operate for profit. Even if there's like some national teams that have more money, like Team Bulgaria versus Team Canada. And when it's for profit, you end up getting a brain drain because certain comms can afford to pay and certain like coaching teams higher payments relative to other people because you're just charging substantially more extortive fees, leading to expertise going towards circuits who are already more established. People might want to volunteer on both sides because they're just like addicted. They enjoy the activity and they're passionate about it. We end up getting a distribution of resources toward people who are profiting more and therefore can afford to give that back to a much larger extent. In terms of weighing institutions getting more money, firstly, who are the institutions who are profiting? Not all institutions can just run a comm because of relatively high startup costs. Like Oxford and Cambridge IVs get the most attendance because they're already the most established. Poor institutions can often not afford to run their own comms in the first place. Secondly, they have other ways to get money. They can push for more school funding. They can have things like community debates, like bake sales and other forms of fundraising. Thirdly, it's internally distributed poorly. Like the rich world's teams end up getting the money, not everyone in the institution. Very proud to stand in opening government.
I thank the Prime Minister for her speech, and I would like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're good.
Yeah, just a second. Amazing. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason why the coaching claim falls out of the debate is because opening government makes no reference to any counterfactual, i.e. they never explain what the rise is in the context of a previous phenomenon where this rise did not exist, which is to say, they never defined the timeline as closing government correctly points out. What the info slide indicates is we're specifically talking about the rise in for-profit tournaments during online debating and the rise in for-profit judging that happened as a consequence of that. Given that comparative, here are 2 reasons that take out opening government's claim out of the round. Note that coaches were always hired by more privileged institutions. The difference is, in the pre-online era, it was far more expensive to do that. Insofar as you had to wheel people over to your country, you had to provide them with some kind of feasible salary, you had to convince them that they need to come to Croatia to coach the Croatian national team. I don't think that was particularly feasible. In the era of for-profit that exists today, at least it coincides with online coaching, which is far more accessible, even though still need to pay people. But secondly, privilege still compounds. HWS still has more money than the Zagreb Debating Union does. Countries like Singapore and England have more WSSC tradition and access to better coaches and debaters they can hire, but they also have more prestigious schools like Eton, which are able to pay for private tutoring, which existed far before this motion. That's not comparative. A bunch of other things are comparative. First of all, this is an incredibly important mechanism for small institutions to raise money. Note that very often these institutions are not big college unions, but they're very often NGOs and stuff like this, like the Zagreb Union is, with very few sources of revenue. And unlike Oxford or the Phil, have a huge amount of members, they can therefore force these members, who are very often upper class, to pay a large subscription fees to the union. You do not have this choice when you're Zagreb or Belgrade. So you can either choose to impose exorbitant costs on a low amount of members for them to go to Worlds and go to Euros and for you to survive as an NGO, or you can try to raise money by organizing Zagreb Open or Belgrade Open online. Of course, opening government says, aha, it's not that easy to organize an online comp. And there's also the issue of accessibility, which the government bench might raise. So a couple of things I want to say here. Online comps have incredibly low organizational costs as opposed to in-person comps, apart from paying judges, CAs, and tab, which is to say that you're still able to organize a tournament where you're going to run a profit, but you're going to charge £65, which is far more accessible than £300 when tournaments are in person. But secondly, note that debating is likely to remain online for two reasons. The first one is there's a huge support for that within the debating community. There is demand for online tournaments. It's expressed in groups like Debating, Serious Posting, and on other pages, because a lot of underrepresented circuits, as Naomi says, don't have access to debating or access to prep tournaments. But secondly, for-profit debating in and of itself is a mechanism why a large amount of tournaments are going to remain online. Because in order to do for-profit debating, you need to be able to run a profit. At the point where you do in-person comps, you have to pay for things like food, like accommodation, like transportation, like airplane tickets. You would have to charge €400 in grade fee to be able to get a profit. So the rise in for-profit debating means that most of debating stays online. The consequence is twofold. First of all, more accessibility for debaters across the board, which is Naomi's own metric in her prime minister's speech. But secondly, that we're still able to have our cake and eat it too. Charge rate of £65, which is larger than the beginning of the online era, but we're able to run a profit because setup costs are literally pay people and have Discord. That's not a lot of money. In terms of getting people to participate at your tournament, first of all, you can recruit your friends. Very often they will do you a favor. CAs will do you a favor in exchange for you judging a couple of spa rounds. We can still give rage waivers to teams that can't pay, but we can force people who can pay, like the privileged ones Naomi talks about, Oxford and Cambridge, etc., to pay for a rage fee, etc. So thirdly, if you choose good dates, if you make a good prep tournament 2 weeks before Euros or Worlds, people are gonna come, even if it costs more, which is to say we're able to get the people necessary to generate the money for small institutions to survive, insofar as they cannot generate revenue otherwise, because they don't get many donations, they don't have many members in the union. It's the only way for those unions and those institutions that Naomi cares about to survive. The second thing I want to talk about is that the rise in for-profit debating also led to the rise in for-profit judging. Why is this the case? Because in order to compete in the market of tournaments, with the proliferation of tournaments that all want to earn a profit, you need to draw people with high-quality judging and high-quality seeing, i.e. you need to show them that your money and your time is worthwhile. Notably, Doxbridge was the first tournament to pay their judges in the online era, and the trend increased from the initial subsidies to now majors paying people 300 or 400 euros if they have a good CV. This is incredibly important as a source of revenue to a large amount of individuals, because when I judge on a weekend and I don't spend honestly that much money as I would on a part-time job working for Uber or Glovo, I can get 60 or 70 pounds to pay my rent. I can pay small outstanding debts. I have disposable income if I'm a college student who doesn't have time to take a part-time job, but I do have free weekends. Incredibly important for people from disadvantaged communities, which opening government seems to care about, because people from underprivileged countries with low GDP per capita that face racism and discrimination were able to leverage a skill which is identity unbiased, but also in a relatively equitable community, and also in relatively valuable currencies, because I get paid the pound or the euro and not the Croatian kuna. It's a huge amount of money in Croatia, which is to say a large amount of people were able to access livelihoods because of this, far more important than debating. But note also that this caused a rise in discussions of how we pay judges. There were discussions of ethics of payment, which is why now we tend to pay judges more as developmental judges. We would pay a judge more regardless of their CV, because we think we should promote equality of genders, because we think we should promote racial equality. This caters specifically to this privileged individuals and did not happen before the timeline shift in 2020. As the info slide says, we're comparative, unlike opening government. Before I move on to more arguments, I'll take closing government.
The debate community is relatively small, generally pretty privileged, and online tournaments, by your own analysis, are relatively less work to set up. Don't you think that means some nerd somewhere is going to set up a World's Prep tournament on either side and people will go?
I mean, yes, because there are benefits to doing this. And the factual proof is that people continue to do this, is that we set up Zagreb Open last year, is that smaller institutions that never organize tournaments, stuff like, or organize them very rarely. We had tournaments in cities where they never happened in person. People would not have done this if there was no profit as a consequence. Third thing I want to say, that the rise of Doxbridge and the rise of for-profit debating created a discussion about the ethics of for-profit debating in groups like Debating, Serious Posting. What this caused is for for-profit tournaments to have to justify themselves as to why they are for-profit. This meant transparency, being upfront as to where the money goes, which Doxbridge did, which first of all is important for the actualization of preferences of individuals. Because when I pay money to something, I'm also giving my agency, my complicity to a particular cause, which is to say, the more transparency there is, the more we're able to allow individuals to actualize their preferences insofar as they know where the reg fee is going. But secondly, it created a counter trend. And this refutes a lot of OG because a lot of people disagreed with for-profit debating. So what they did is organize tournaments that paid all of reg fee to charity, promoted charities. People went out of protest to go CA stuff like Uhuru Worlds for free. So they could say, I oppose for-profit debating. People coach for free and give lessons for free on YouTube, as Naomi says, because they oppose for-profit debating. But this did not happen to that extent before for-profit debating happened, insofar as the counter trend was caused by for-profit debating. We did not have tournaments donating all of the reg fee to charity before that. The last thing I want to say is a principle claim. Note that the government side has to normatively oppose rising for-profit debating. There is no a priori obligation of any individual to provide their skills and services for free. If people disagree with that kind of provision, they would have vetted that by not accepting the service given. Insofar as people have vetted that and accepted it, i.e. they actively bought into it, the service exists with the consent of the consumers. Given there is no objective morality or way to determine a metric for it, this is the only metric in which we can principally judge this debate. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the LO for fine speech, and I would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, sure. Good.
Let me just check which mic I'm using. Okay. I want to be very clear on how this rise looks and how the alternative look. I think that on our side of the house with the rise, it is implied that a lot of more people will be doing these competitions for profit. But also more for-profit competitions means the normalization of for-profit competitions. So there is a certain expectancy that each competitions should be for profit, and this increases over time, which then means that a lot more people who are generally seeking profit will turn to the debating as a profitable activity, and more of these people who are generally cost-driven and are generally driven towards making a particular profit will actually enter the community and will be the ones who are organizing these particular tournaments, thus increasing the overall competitions between tournaments. Many of these increased competitions will hurt the most vulnerable ones because and actually compete with tournaments like Zagreb and all of these particular places. Now, why is this extremely problematic? But before that, I want to be very clear on profit. If you are raising money for the NGO that is existing in your particular country, or your particular student union that is a particular body that redistributes specifically for debating, this is not actual profit. If I, let's say, organize Sofia Open as the Bulgarian Debate Association, which is a non-profit NGO, this is the definition of NGOs, and this is the same NGO that like exists in Zagreb, in Belgrade, and etc. These places, by their own, these organizations, by their own constitutions, are required to only spend that particular profit in their own particular causes, in terms of advancing debating, in terms of gaining access, and all of those particular people. Profit would mean if I organize Zagreb Open or Sofia Open, and all of the remaining money I take away for myself and buy Dom Perignons or buy anything that I actually particularly want. So they need to defend this particular characterization of profit. They cannot just say, like, on our side of the house, nobody is allowed to take profit and actually help their communities and make some money in order to help their particular people. But I think that the likely version on our side is that debaters are doing it through NGOs and through these particular organizations. So in terms of that, I think that there is on our side of the house, the likely scenario of this is less of these for-profit competitions, but also in the case in which they're for-profit, they're actually made by particular NGOs or student union with the specific purpose of redistributing these particular monies. But even if you don't buy all of the things, I want to also engage with the competition problem. To the extent in which now we have more competition and incentive from different actors to do a lot of promotion, to get all of the best judges, what happens is that Zagreb Open happens, or actually, let's say Sofia Open. Sofia Open this year will happen on the 21st, 23rd of October. All of you are actually very welcome to actually come. Now, what is the problem here though? We do not have a lot of money, and this is not going to be an extremely large for-profit competitions. If the fuckers from Doxbridge decide to make a competition on the same fucking date, we have to directly compete with them for IAs and people that we have to actually have to come to our competitions, regardless of whether both are online or one is physical and things like that. Which means that to the extent in which they actually have already collected more money, they're going to outbid us as a small community, because a lot of the good judges will be forced to go into these particular places. And yes, maybe some judges are good people, but it's absolutely okay for people who have their own struggles, or poor students and things like that, to choose to actually get paid versus to do a particular favor, or at least most of the time they will be inclined to choose the one who actually pays them, which means that now Sofia Open doesn't have the ability to get good judges, or if they want to get judges, they have to pay a much higher price that makes the competition not happen in the first place, cannot make the competition actually not break even in the first place. So these competitions is either going to happen, but it will have much worse quality, meaning that the more variations of Sofia Open are less likely to happen, because people will generally have worse competitive experience in these cases. But it also means that more people are likely to go to the other competitions. I would also know that there is a clear incentive for these bigger competitions that are already made by people who have more disposable incomes compared to smaller communities, is actually they have also the incentive to, for example, include things such as cash prices, because these things then justify their fee, but they can also increase that particular fee. Even if the fee doesn't increase, it creates like the ability to attract more of these people and get more of the debaters on the stage. I think that all of these particular things, even though they say judges have more accessibility, I think that a lot of people in our community are, first of all, a lot of them are a bit more privileged. Second of all, a lot of them are smart people who would likely be able to, at some point in their life, get a fairly okay particular job. And I think that on the comparative, that means that generally some communities do not have the access to make these particular tournaments and get more people into debating within their own country. That is far more important than actually, sure, I'll take CO if they have anything, not all. All?
For-profit means a switch of calculus. It means I'm actively looking to make a profit at the end of a quarter or a year as an NGO, meaning that the rate fee is now €60 and not a symbolic 5 or 10, as some competitions have done. This debate is not debated on dictionaries and semantics, debate the actual trend that happened.
What I'm saying is, look, I don't think that this can be certified as profit. Obviously, there is a difference between the different types of profit. But what I'm saying is that when you have more of these profit-driven competitions, this is generally worse, and you'll never be able to compete with the bigger ones in the first place. So the benefit that you're trying to accrue will never happen in the first place. I think what you also need to realize is that on both sides of the house is completely symmetrical in terms of like having the incentive to do online competitions. And obviously, if you're a smaller society, you would like to do those online competitions. But again, the problem is the fact that even if you make that competition, you have to compete with other competitions that necessarily have much more funding and are able to attract and basically make your competition directly worse, meaning that it will not happen in many of the cases in the first place. We really want to have Sofia Open, guys. This is the most important part in the debate. So please, from the 21st to the 23rd October, come to Sofia, enjoy some fun. Even if I lose this one, this is the most important impact.
I think the DPM for fine speech, and I would like to welcome the DL.
Well, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Several clashes on which we win, but first, just two direct responses against the motion. First, the discourse is masturbatory. You get the best and brightest from across the world, get them to discuss this shite. There's many salient moral issues in the world which you could be investigating and getting proper discourse in these instances, and you chose to do this for shame. Secondly, I wish we pushed that button in the last motion. Secondly, in response to closing government's point of information, I do think a lot of people who experience poverty, like myself, do get into discourse and debating because it's the only instance in which we get people to listen to our voices and hear what we have to say about the world. I think that's absolutely out of this motion. Now, the clashes that we win. First on the principle. Absolutely no response from this from opening government. It was a well-formed principle in which we explained that the individuals, because you have no direct obligation to any other individuals apart from non-intervention into the context of their lives, which is saying non-aggression against them, that the decisions you make should not be regretted unless they formed essentially an attack against those other individuals. Insofar as individuals had the choice to access Doxbridge and the choice to enter in these kinds of for-profit institutions, we say that there is no evaluable moral metric objectively by which to adjudicate this kind of perspective, apart from the individual's decision making and whether it was a legitimate decision for them to take in the first place. No response from this opening government. I'd like to note this is a universal thing, and secondly, applies regardless of whether you think the for-profit debating was utilitarianly good, which is to say whether the consequences were good or bad, as may be speculative in the rest of this debate. Second thing then, I think perhaps more salient, on small universities. We told you that small unis have no stable revenue sources because they can't get massive subscription fees because of the lack of notoriety. And secondly, because they can't get sponsorship for the same reason. Notably, profit by definition, Nikki, I'm sorry, means making more money than your overheads. Definitionally then, any competition which seeks to generate profit for being respent within that same institution or indeed on any other thing, like on sending your teams to Worlds and Euros, is a profitable competition as opposed to other non-profit competitions like International Metaphysics Open Part 2, which you should also come to, and all those other things. Therefore, the comparative is very simple. We explained to you that the ability to get people to come to your small competition, either because A, they're from the local area and they can get their university to pay, B, because you can get CAs that you're friends with, i.e. social capital rather than regular capital, which is more universally distributed, and C, getting good quality judges, can make people come to your competition, even if it's not the the biggest competition in the world. Look at like Warwick Worlds last year, where they were able to do this kind of thing. The only response we get from this to opening government is, aha, but what if Doxbridge sets the competition at the same date? Let's just look at decision calculuses there. If Sophia Open sets their competition date first, why would Doxbridge set their date there when they know that there is an evaluable competition against them on that same day? It makes financial sense to not do that. Secondly, similarly, if Doxbridge set it up first, Sophia Open would choose a different date. There's 52 weekends in the year. I'm sure they could find one. Therefore, that response doesn't land. What does this mean in the context of this debate? And I'd like to know, look, you don't have to go to every fucking competition, even if the people in this final might disagree, because for the majority of individuals who take part in debating, what they want to do is go into Worlds and Euros for a life skill, seeing other people from different walks of life, communicate with them, making friends, making enemies even if they want to, but also the ability to have that kind of thing on your CV, saying I did go to the World Championships of university debating, and that is a very valuable thing. Those kinds of things do not rely on going to every single competition every weekend, only rely on just being able to go this couple of times, and you can't do that if you're financially locked out. Discourse indeed gets worse when you have people from only upper class backgrounds going. We say small competitions are better able to do that, and they can spread the costs across because they're able to just think like charge £5 or £10 extra, which makes a huge difference to the one or two teams that they might be sending to internationals, but for the individuals paying the price, it's not that huge. And indeed, if it was, they could just choose to not go to that second or third competition that weekend. Indeed, the price is oftentimes pushed against their university, to whom they're able to say, this is a really important discursive excursion and that kind of thing. Those universities tend to be more privileged than the individuals within them. So on the comparative, small competitions are better able to survive. And indeed, that means that people can go to international competitions, which is really important. Coaching then, this is where OG really hang their hat. For the reasons that Tim gave and got no response, this is absolutely not comparative. Because if you can't use regular capital and you have to instead use social capital to leverage judging skills, that gets locked towards the couple of institutions and indeed countries that have a history of competing well at these kinds of things. The comparative is two things. Firstly, the conception that we talked about, the guilt that people feel in the face of online debating, means to get people more likely to do things after they compete in Doxbridge, to go and do things like coaching for those other institutions because they now feel proximately that guilt that relates to it. Secondly, it relates to the idea you can, if you're an institution that maybe has a good year and is able to get some windfall of capital, or indeed you can leverage your institutional college to pay for it, to pay for good coaches, even if that's not just a scholarship or like a workshop once or twice. With regards to the parents and the idea of parents paying for these things, I think firstly, fuck them. They're yuppie parents that pay for these kinds of things anyway, whether it's soccer or debating, I don't think it matters. Also, we increase capital in this institution means more likelihood for scholarships and more incentive for it, as we explained to you. But also I'd like to note that I just think that this is broadly speaking non-comparative. It happened prior to this trend. No explanation of the increase in this in DPM speech, as was flagged in L leader opposition, and therefore not comparative. The guilt, however, here creates goodwill, which I would say you get more things like pro-ams, extensive feedback, coaching, online workshops, serious posting posts from top debaters when they more perceive an obligation to give back to a community, when they're more aware of the idea of financial capital being restricting in these kinds of contexts. On the idea of IAs, I think this is where we clearly win the debate in this context, because when you have for-profit debating, you pay your judges more. Previously, IAs were just paid relative to the idea that you would pay your train costs. I think the way for this is very simple, and before I get into the mechanization of it, which is to say, for disprivileged individuals who are able to get the ability to just happen to be a good judge by random luck, to get a good insight in the world, and indeed the mechanization we persuade to you in opening opposition that explains why you get more capital to invest in those kinds of judges as an idea of an auxiliary benefit, developmental judges, etc., means that people with a weak currency are able to get a huge amount of money in pounds or in euros to do things like pay their rent. I indeed paid a lot of my rent for the Zagreb Open CA funding or IA funding. Before I move on to this explanation, CG.
Dylan, are you happier because you do a lot of debating?
Categorically, yes. It has been a really important activity for me because for the reasons I outlined at the top of my speech. So I'm not sure what that POI is getting at, although I hope Matt is happy in his own life. We get more of that on our side. The only response to this is the idea that these people are already privileged. Absolutely no mechanization as to why that's the case. The context in which we're discussing is disprivileged. Secondly, that they're smart, so they get better jobs in the future. This only works if you believe the capitalist lie that meritocracy is the basis of the economy. In reality, things like luck, social networks, etc. We indeed expand those social networks when we get more people interacting with people from more elements of the world, not only through IAs, but through international competitions, but also the fact that you have this kind of intelligence means you can get this kind of thing in a valuable currency outside of just being able to start up a small business in your local community. We get actual international cross solidarity in those kinds of instances. Let me just explain to you what we've proved to you in this debate. Look, Oxford and Cambridge always existed and were always for-profit institutions. But we put speculation on them and credit against them. We're able to investigate these kinds of things, get transparency about these things. That means that the regular competitions, which weren't for-profit, but were implicitly for-profit before the rise, get the scrutiny that they now deserve. We get more IAs from around the world, the most vulnerable individuals within the context of this debate, getting accessibility to a world of discourse and accessibility of opportunities in that kind of context. Principally, we should support this decision because it is a valuable decision that was made without the harm against another individual. People can choose to not go to competitions every weekend. Indeed, after this competition, I may choose not to. But I would propose to you that this has been a good decision for the majority of the world. Therefore, you should oppose the motion.
I think the deal of a fine speech, I would like to welcome the member of government.
Great. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
Yes, sir.
Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in CG. First, I'm going to clarify the government counterfactual and explain why it frames at the top half debate. Second, I'll explain why on our side you basically get the same activity, but for less money and why that's good. And thirdly, I'll give systemic reasons as to why this makes the debate community more exclusionary. On opening opposition, I think that Tin firstly has the correct counterfactual in the debate. The rise is from 2020 onward with the rise of online BP debating. This means you cannot let them get away with characterizing Belgrade Open, Sofia Open as part of the trend of for-profit debating. Crucially, these circuits ran tournaments in person, charged reg fees to pay for their contingents to go to Worlds or whatever, before the trend in 2020. Tin's own acknowledgement that the rise is about Doxbridge and online iterations of IVs later takes this out of the debate insofar the asymmetric incentives to charge small profit before the rise of this trend. We're clearly talking about the trend of Doxbridge comps. We're clearly talking about the trend of these charging high prices. Secondly, the incentives to do these comps go far beyond actual profit, i.e. you want name recognition for your society and the broader community. You have a desire to see friends and socialize, especially during COVID when this motion was very salient. We organized the LSE Open at marginal profit this year. This suggests that lots of societies would still do this on either side. And Tin concedes to my POI that people will still do this on either side. Insofar as I think there are really great people like the people who run Uhura World, shout out to Umar, the people who run Big Boys Open, shout out to that group chat, and the people who ran Untitled Pre-WUDC, shout out to Waji and Yusuf, I imagine there are still likely to be symmetric incentives for some nerd somewhere to host comps of comparable quality on either side. Finally, I just think the rise of for-profit debating actually made these comps far more crowded out because online IVs could be themselves as more competitive and either steal the IA pools of those small tournaments, or even if they're not held on the same weekend, burn out enough IAs for having done those ones because they're more competitive to the exclusion of others when they might leave their weekend free. Like if you're hosting a tiny tournament a few weekends after Doxbridge, a lot of IAs are still going to be burned out from doing Doxbridge. So good luck getting a good IA pool, even if the weekend is free, as Dylan glibly suggests. Lastly, on IA payment and discourse, you still pay IAs for nonprofit. This probably would, like, if you're nonprofit, right? You'd probably still have to pay pay for their labor, right? And at the point at which exposure to more circuits would have occurred on either side of the house, because COVID happened on either side of the house, you've gotten the same discourse around paying IAs a fair wage, and you would have to pay them a relatively stable amount on either side of the house. I think Naomi framed that pretty clearly. Finally, on discourse, even before 2020, you had this discourse. People shit on LSE Open for years about charging a profit in serious posting. I imagine the benefit of the discourse is symmetric, even if it's concentrated only to somewhat like larger Iona institutions, as opposed to the trend of more people organizing for-profit competitions. On the counterfactual, I think that on either side, the likely counterfactual is there are competitions of roughly comparable quality on either side, just people don't make money off of them. Why? Firstly, as I've alluded to in responses, there are lots of nerds who do this to free. The debate community is filled with people who organize competitions for free, people who develop software that's free to use, lots of free alternatives to Doxbot, Taptastic, and so on that are functional. I think the worst case is that people just debate on Discord or mixed idea, and I think the comparative shift in quality is relatively minimal. We probably only consider it a really important quality of life adjustment because we do so much debating. I think a lot of people would either do it anyway, and the really serious nerds might grumble a bit, but still do it anyway regardless. Secondly, people care about things like reputation in the community for some reason, so they sometimes host things for free, right? I think that's something they do. Also, some people are just genuinely altruistic. As to all the people I talked about, I don't think they did it as a counter trend to Doxbridge. I think they did it because they're cool people. But thirdly, tons of institutions want to host tournaments on either side of the house because debaters want competitive practice, and therefore I don't want to host the tournaments instead. But I probably flip this right just insofar as you get better IA pools at this point, seen at my earlier analysis. But I imagine that finally, this is all just incredibly marginal. Because imagine explaining to your average informed voter friend about the comparative. Aha, I had to choose between a competition without Doxbot, I had to go to a competition without Doxbot instead. I don't think any rational person would be convinced that this trade-off matters to any extent. But recognize this also means OG is very marginal, because I just think the developing circuits probably just make their own tournaments and they're just as competitive and they pay people a living wage, just not for profit, because there are tons of incredible judges from the developing world and tons of really motivated people who want to make these things happen. I also think the school use coaching thing is out. I won't deal with that further. The only thing I really want to quibble here is the idea that Oxbridge would continue to dominate debating, right? Guys, it's 2022. Look at the break of this tournament. I think that's all the evidence you need for that. What actually changes then, and what is comparative in this debate? I think what's comparative at the point at which I framed at the top half, that people pay more money for virtually the same experience they would have gotten if they paid less of it. Importantly, this rises above the OO principle, because sure, maybe they prove that some people would exchange the capital for this experience in either world. I posit what this means is that they do it on either side of the house, even if there was a marginal reduction in quality, because those people aren't addicts. But I think what happens on their side is that for a lot of people firstly just have to pay more money for a hobby that genuinely gives you very few marginal returns. Let's continue what spending money on debating entails, right? You go to a place online or in person where you yell at all of nerds for a weekend or longer. This is A, exhausting, but B, a very, very weird environment to socialize in, because you talk to a lot of people about things like the break, and that's really like confusing or alienating to a lot of people. Secondly, there's a hedonistic treadmill. You always want more accomplishments when you're competitive, and even when you win, there's incredible diminishing marginal returns to this, because what you get is you feel dopamine for a few minutes, and then you realize what you're winning at is functionally the equivalent of winning at Mario Kart, and then you're sad because no one cares. Then the best part of debating is genuinely that you meet people and make friends, but most people can make friends outside debating because most people have lives outside of debating, and I think that that's really good. So it adds value to your life. I'm not minimizing it. I'm glad Dylan has fun with it. I have fun with it too. But at the end of the day, it's a game that's fun. What's the comparative? There are lots of games that are fun that you can also spend money on at the point at which they cost way less money. Why does this maximize your preferences? First, you can buy a DLC for a video game, or buy a video game like EU4 for comparable prices to go to Doxbridge. This brings you more utility because you can still debate and also get more diversity of experience through like gaming. This beats Naomi, because I don't really think the average debater needs money to put food on the table or whatever. I think you get a greater quantity and diversity of life experience, which fulfills more preferences. But secondly, most people are not uber nerds. They want to have experiences outside debating because most people have multiple preferences. At the point where they can get as good an experience debating, or maybe better, they'll probably do more things. Before I explain IAs and other things, I'll take opening up.
You normatively oppose the rise of Doxbridge, and yet you and 200 other people pay to be here, despite the existence of other nerds who might have organized tournaments that don't pay for somebody's champagne, therefore providing your consent. What does the average informed voter have to say about that?
So this actually really was the only tournament this weekend that was accessible to me. That's the reason I'm here. Moving on. Why do I think IAs probably get more money? Look, even if there are fewer competitions on weekends, which I don't think is true, they can pay you more because they're not skimming massive amounts of money off the top. So IAs probably generally get more money. I think that's pretty reasonable. Thirdly, the people who run for-profit debating competitions and make money off them are really weird. Why? Firstly, debaters have really bizarre moral intuitions. Some of them actually think there's a gov case in the semifinal, like Dylan McCarthy. Secondly, they spend money on really weird things like Hegel books, if you're Dylan McCarthy, or paying for really rich, expensive educational institutions like the LSE. Thirdly, they're relatively rich, so they spend their money on things which are additive rather than important. The comparative is, if you give some money by spending it on a burger on a shop down the street, you contribute to that small business's economic recovery from COVID or whatever. If you spend money on something that provides marginal more utility to people who aren't rich nerds who don't need that money, you provide marginally more utility for people in that life. I think that's great because that's actually a marginal change to someone's life who actually means something. Everything else in this debate barely matters. This is actual impact, which I think is great. Finally, it doesn't just make debating more exclusionary. Naomi says it shuts people out. I think it concentrates the competitive pool of teams at one really big tournament. It means the big, really competitive ones cut everyone else. It means that you don't get smaller comps that people can win and enjoy and get dopamine from winning tinier comps and stuff because they get crowded out by the big for-profit comps. Look, don't let Tin and his unholy alliance with Matt Hazel fool you into believing that for-profit debating is the way to go. You have to vote for closing government because whether nerds get to debate with Doxbot or Captastic really doesn't matter all that much. What matters is the marginal amount of utility you gain in closing government. Incredibly proud to stand in CG.
I think the member of Go for French speech, I would like to welcome the member of opposition.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, sure.
Okay, I'll take POIs verbally. Okay. All right, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 extensions from closing opposition. First, I want to flip something that opening government says about how online debating tournaments were more expensive than online for-profit tournaments were more expensive than the counterfactual. We think that for-profit debating creates incentives to lower the price. Why? Because oftentimes universities, and especially elite universities, which have lots of money, which run these debate tournaments, had massive amounts of money that they were wasting because there was a lack of competition. They like these networks that like all agreed to like set and collude prices at roughly the same levels. There was no incentive to want to dramatically lower the price because nobody else was doing it. And these institutions were not super worried about maximizing the number of people who would go to their tournaments because they had the prestige of saying Oxford, Cambridge, Ivy, etc. I think that for-profit debating created incentives to figure out the ways to cut costs as much as possible. The intuition for this is, I remember there was a Facebook post where Doxbridge was advertising itself as being cheaper or as cheap as Cambridge and Oxford Ivy, despite the fact that those were technically not run for profit. Oftentimes, this is because debate societies often want to spend things on frivolous things like trips and things that they don't really need, like paying business class, etc. So this actually creates incentives to cut down the prices and actually flips a lot of the material that opening government says. Also, they clearly have to compete with non-for-profit tournaments as well, right? Like nobody would go to or people wouldn't go to Doxbridge if it wasn't either significantly higher quality than other tournaments or if it was as cheap as other tournaments. Second extension then, about allowing online debating to begin in the first place. I want to frame this very importantly. Opening opposition argues that online debating is important because it is uniquely accessible. And they say that for-profit tournaments allow it to continue to exist. Our argument is that for-profit debating allowed online tournaments and online debating to come into existence in the first place, and it created incentives for debating to continue to survive in the online era. This underlies the claim of opening opposition, because if online debating didn't exist in the first place, there would be nothing to continue and none of those benefits would have existed. Why do we think that during the rise of COVID, it is unlikely that debate ever would have happened? First, we think that on behalf of universities that host tournaments, there's far less incentives for them to do so in an online world. They wouldn't have gained large amounts of clout from hosting prospective students. It's not fun to host debate tournaments as members of debating societies. So if there aren't that much clout to be gained from hosting prospective students who might attend that university, there's no incentives to do so. Many college students who would have been otherwise running these tournaments were also preoccupied with personal issues relating to COVID. Moreover, university administrations in developing countries might have lacked online infrastructure. See, for example, the NASL or IB being canceled. In the counterfactual, the profit incentive created an incentive to begin online, to start and begin and do the work of figuring out whether online debating was profitable to begin with. We dramatically increased the supply. Second, they provided a proof of concept. The fact that Doxbridge was the first major online tournament that many, many people attended, and it proved that people were actually willing to engage and pay money to do online debating. In the counterfactual, it is far less likely that a society run by students would have made the risk of running these massive tournaments if it was the case that there was a massive risk that they would fail, and if they didn't think that anybody would do it, and they didn't think that people would show up. Moreover, the money provided an incentive for judges and IAs to enter online debating rather than simply quitting. A lot of people thought online debating was really, really boring. They were used to in-person debating, and they were comparing online debating to the previous world where you had to travel around the world, see your friends, and do other things, etc. Also, I just want to note that judging tends to be less fun than debating. That's why debaters pay to go to tournaments, but we pay judges to come. So the supply only could have been met with for-profit judging, where you were willing to charge enough money to get and hire good judges to come. This is why and also the fact that many CAs of these tournaments were also like partially sharing the profits of these tournaments and weren't just being paid directly by these tournaments. Like I know that the Doxbridge people got a lot of their friends and like split the profits, etc. Like Matt Hazel is running this tournament apparently. Moreover, for-profit debating created incentives for people to spend lots of time figuring out how to run good online tournaments, setting up things like DocSpot, coordinating with TabbyCat, etc. In the counterfactual, the quality would have been a lot lower since no individual nonprofit university society, which is run by students, has the incentive, has such a strong incentive to run really good competitions to maximize the number of people who come. These things now trickle down to higher quality debating tournaments on our side, as institutions with less capacity can just do things like copy DocSpot and replicate those things instead of having to come up with them on their own. This also applies to the mechanism of institutions now being able to run for profit. Like if you weren't like, yes, university students can figure this out, but if they weren't doing it for profit and didn't think there would be a large payoff, there would be much less of an incentive to do so. I'll take a point now.
The reason why small institutions need so much money in the first place is that comps are so expensive. Even if they get marginally more, it's internally distributed to a couple WUDC teams, which is less important than thousands of people within institutions who can't even afford to run comps in the first place.
Okay, the problem with this is that it assumes that the marginal extra expensive Doxbridge is sufficient to dissuade people from going or is a significant accessibility barrier. The problem is that because debate filters in so many ways for income and going to universities that have like high levels of income before, once you even get to the point of being in a society and deciding whether to go to Doxbridge or not, that marginal cost isn't like that big of a reason. And the reason why is very few debating societies began during online. These are just the ones that existed. It's very hard to start a debate society online. So most of the debate societies that already existed were used to paying much, much more money during the in-person era. Like if you could afford to pay for flights to WUDC, or if you had people who could afford to do so, then you certainly could afford to go to Doxbridge. So this is just not a margin where people were not able to pay for it. Third extension, when you get more people interested in joining debating. What are the reasons why this is the case? I actually want to flip a lot of what OG says and explain why for-profit coaching and debate academies can make high school debate more accessible. First, people often do not go into debating if they do not have a network around them or any coaching. Like people don't want to do debating alone. They want to do it with their friends. Many people just don't have debate clubs in their high schools. In our world, they can go to institutions like Learning Leaders or Dialogy, etc. These coaching schools are cheap. First, because they split costs among multiple students. Maybe you have a marginal advantage if you pay 300 students $300 an hour to get like Jason Zhao to teach you, but I don't think the marginal impact is that much. Second, you get lower fixed costs because these are online, which also means lots of competition because you don't just have the local like Learning Leaders in like Shanghai. You could go to like any one of the like millions of these debate academies that are proliferating. Also, there's so many debaters who are like bored and want to earn money, so it's an incredibly competitive field. Also, these schools then make debate more accessible. People often go back and set up debate societies in their high schools once they went to these schools. They have an incentive to do this, like it looks good on a college CV, there's school pride, and also seeing people from your high school succeed makes you more likely to want to enter debate. The counterfactual is private schools don't need to use for profit because they have access to alumni networks and coaching people who want to do this. The counterfactual is only the kids who go to Eton getting into Team England versus other people being able to do so. Moreover, we think that Doxbridge and the proliferation of higher quality judging and just the greater number of tournaments online marginally benefited people who had less access to training more. Why? Because places like Oxford, Cambridge had access to internal training to begin with, but for an institution that is just starting up, being able to attend a high quality tournament is a form of training and the marginal benefit is a lot greater for them. For all these reasons, we think this increases access and gets more people into debating. We're very proud to oppose.
I think the member of Oak for Fine Speech, and I would like to welcome the government.
Hi, am I, Matt, mute yourself. Am I audible?
Yeah, sure.
Great. For POIs, please put them in the chat. Don't verbally interrupt. Matt, if you could do me a quick favor and please fill this water bottle up. Great. Great. Three, two, one. As someone who has CA'd at Doxbridge, the illustrious Doxbridge Valentine's Day Open, aka the Simp IV, the greatest of the Doxbridges, I can tell you it's probably fine to regret it. I'm going to get into the comparative first, then off bench, CO first, and then going into OG. So on the comparative, the quality in comps, or the thesis of our case, is that they're largely going to be very similar, and any decrease isn't that important because of how small a facet of life it is. The comparative then is more people are likely to have more money in their pockets than the people who profit for a roughly equally service, or even if there's a decline in a service, a not very important service. I'm going to explain to you now a bunch of reasons why the profiteers are likely to spend money badly or worse than a bunch of debaters. One, if you're someone who spends this much time and effort once you've left an activity to come back and haunt it, you've revealed that you're probably psychotic. Secondarily, they have explicitly stated that they use the money for hookers, drugs, and Bitcoin. Hazelnut told me that in a call when I was a CA for Doxbridge Valentine's Day Open, aka the Simp IB. You can't confirm or deny this, but it would be funnier if you did confirm it. Thirdly, they have really shitty haircuts. Why is a shitty haircut a signal that you are unlikely to spend money properly? One, it's a lack of self-reflection or respect. Or two, it's a lack of awareness about trends in the world, which indicates you don't pay attention to the world around you, which indicates you don't care about the world around you if you did not care enough to pay attention about it. Thirdly, it's a large sum of money all at once. Fourthly, the majority of money is isolated to 2, maybe 3 people, whereas the comparative where costs would have been less is much more widely distributed. Fifthly or sixthly, at this point, they're probably relatively well off. So the things they spend the money on are luxury items that are less utile. The info slide literally says Soy Roy uses his money to buy Dom Pérignons or whatever the fuck that is. I assume it's like a piece of wine. Let's get on to CO. This extension is genuinely less important than what Matt told you. Insofar as Matt provided, in like 10 ways debating doesn't die, I'm going to add a few more. If people have to attend slightly worse debate tournaments, I don't care now if you spend 20 or 30 pounds in a shop that really needed additional business instead of Hazelnut's latest comp. I just think this matters more. Also, why the fuck is getting more people into debating necessarily a benefit? They never explain why that's good. Look at Matt. Do you really want more people like him? He's genuinely frightening. On opening opposition then, and note I'm going to be very clear here because a lot of CO's case is also about there's going to be more of it stays online because of the rise. So I'm going to rebut that in OO, but it also is rebutting CO, so put that on your notes. On OO, firstly on the principle. Matt's response, which is that, sure, you have a right to spend money on Doxbridge, but that's really sad, so go touch grass instead. My response is L plus ratio plus lick my balls. I don't care about the principle. On the practical case, their large part of their case is for profit means more of it stays online and they're more high quality with better judges, etc. A lot of impacts. That's also CO's extension that online debating wouldn't have happened. I can maybe blame OO a little bit, but maybe David wasn't around when COVID hit, when there were tons of nonprofit tournaments, which ran anyway. I.e. Yossi Moskovich, the boy, the legend, ran the Berlin IB with Milos for free. There are tons of incentives, and Matt explained very clearly why it's the case that you probably would still get a comparative amount of comps on either side. I don't know why people who would have stopped debating just because there are only somewhat less quality judges there or whatever. Like, worst case, I will guarantee you this now. I promise Matt would have run tournaments, and he will because he has no life. Why then, for more structural analysis, is untrue or unlikely that it would have escaped the online era or there won't be like more debating online comparatively. One, OO's own analysis for the demand that exists to make debate online, but secondarily, the incentives to do it go beyond actual profit. And this is a very critical part of my speech. I've been told to be more explicit to judges, so on your notes, put like a star and say, Ahmed said this is explicit. Why do the incentives go beyond actual profit? One, the desire by debaters on the ground to compete and simulate competitive environments so they get their friends to make one or compel them. Secondarily, there's like weird people that exist within the activity who want to build rep in a way which they can't external to debate and make friends, and they can be known as the person that ran a very big tournament. Thirdly, there's a historical precedent by institutions, i.e. Oxford still hosts the Oxford Online, even if it's without a profit, because it's about maintaining the name and the image. Fourthly, the mercy and generosity of people like Lucy, Andrew, Jeremiah, Marina, Parth, or most importantly, critically, people like Hot Mommy Jess who have given so much back to this community. And this is a tangent, but gentlemen, she's single. If you're going to Euros, she asked me to wingman her and market her in this speech. So there you go, Jess. I want to add a piece of framing after these alternative incentives though. The tipping point is not profit because money is not a huge consideration to their decisions to over participate or really participate in this activity. Because if they really cared about money or profit, they would literally do anything else for money. In other words, OO and CO's impacts rely on for-profit comps where profit is not a leading or compelling incentive. The upshot is all of their impacts from this, accountability, fighting big institutions, blah, blah, fucking blah, are entirely symmetric because the incentives to provide online comps and therefore the good impacts they talk about that are also high quality in general exist external of profit as a consideration. We are not dependent on the hazelnuts and soy roys of debating in order to still get online comps. Second argument is led to for-profit judging. I think this mechanism is also flimsy, not mutually exclusive, insofar as large amounts of comps still exist in the world on either side. There's a competitive incentive to pay them more to get them to judge your comp instead of another one, or alternatively pay them enough that it's higher than the alternative opportunity cost of getting a life and smelling grass. But I'll actually flip this. I think judges make less in their world. Why? The for-profit comps carry substantial power over their rep that dictates how much funding they get at other comps. So on up, they have to take whatever a for-profit comp gives them, because that judge break determines then their CV because of the name recognition that it has. If you don't buy that, I did other cool rebuttal before. Before doing a lot of weighing now to OG and concluding my stand-up routine, I will take quickly.
15 seconds. You see, your extension is to say that people can spend their money elsewhere, yet you chose to spend it here instead of actually buying yourself a nice dinner and a few beers. Debaters want to spend money on debating. If comp quality doesn't change, as you say, then what we win on is the principle, the discussions, the counter trend, the judges, and small institutions. You didn't rebut all five.
That's 50. I responded to the principle. I said L plus ratio plus like my balls. In terms of like they have a revealed preference that they will debate on either side. The difference is, yes, they're going to debate on either side, but the difference is the thing that they are debating largely stays roughly the same on either side. So they have more money in their pocket to buy tissues to wipe their tears when they don't break at a comp. The point is that they have comparatively more access to utility and money. And also, like, even if they won't spend it on anything else, it's better that more of them have that money than just the soy roys and hazelnuts of debating that buy Dom Pérignons. On OG, let's weigh now. On inequality, I think this is largely going to fall out of this debate. The first impact of it is like it rewards families who are rich and gives them a leg up. Families from rich areas who go to rich schools like Eton symmetrically have a leg up on either side because daddy makes sure that Eton hires daddy Brian Wong or Dan Berman, excellent judges, by the way, in case they watch this when they're judging me at Worlds, to be the head coach of Eton. Secondarily, extortion of parents. Education companies exist outside of debate that extort parents to say they don't do debate, come let them do fucking trivia that helps them get into college when it's not true. Thirdly, the advantage is the Western Circuit. It's unlikely to be a massive tipping point because the Western Circuit has a funnel of schooling kids who want to go to Ivies and top Western schools who provide more economic mobilities. They have name recognition. Thirdly, they have more international students that have more rep and build rep for the team. Thirdly, they have a path dependency in history where they get world champions to coach them or judge their trials. In other words, the legacies of colonialism and capitalism are more powerful than even the mighty hazelnut and soy roy. I think we've clearly won. Happy end to Doxbridge.
I think we go for the fine speech. We would like to welcome the opposition.
Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Firstly, the closing government extension. Let's quickly delete them from the round. They say debate is bad, or at least debate is not that important because people do it for temporary surges of dopamine, and therefore what outweighs is charging people for debate because people spend their money on debate, and that is inherently a bad thing. That's really all that extension, despite all they've said so far. There are 5 problems with this. Number 1, there is a revealed preference. People make a decision to do it a lot. How do we weigh this decision against their claim about short-term dopamine surges? Morally, we care a lot more about your decision-making than CG's judgment about whether it is a rational or irrational choice to continue to debate, even if that involves spending money out of your pocket. Therefore, if we show you that people are able to access this preference to debate a lot more, because by the way, preference construction is the only meaningful frame to understand morality, we automatically outframe them. Number 2, debating has externalities. David explains that debate's values by nature involve both things like critical evaluation and thinking about the world that lead to more socially progressive thinking, meaning debate is valuable and isn't just valuable for the individual who's doing the activity. Number 3, our extension outframes them and is logically prior. The reason why is because our extension, at least our first extension, is that competitions and coaching, somewhat counterintuitively, are actually cheaper on GovBench, meaning debaters who want to debate anyway end up spending more money in CG's world. So if we prove our extension, we automatically outframe them. Number 4, CG knifes OG. Here's why. Opening governance claims you have more access to debate. If you have more access to debate, you debate more often. By MG's own logic, this is a trend, but even prior to this charge, competitions charge some small numbers of reg fees. In opening governance world, if more people debate because it's more accessible, in many cases, they end up spending more rather than less money on debate, meaning by OG's own logic, CG's extension can't work. Number 5, it's a transfer of money. Like, frankly, we are fine with a competition making a money instead of a person, because at the end of the competition is something like a debating society spending money on itself. What does spending money on itself look like? It looks like doing things like ensuring that it's able to organize live stream for its members, and so on. And that also means a transfer of money to the rest of the economy. I don't think CG really works in this debate. Then on OG. OG's first claim is that there is inequality of opportunity in the coaching market. The first problem with this is I mean, we acknowledge opening opposition's response that this is a trend, and therefore the trend of commercial coaching existed prior to 2020 as well. But we think it's undeniably true that in some contexts, coaching did in fact increase. That is, it is true that new academies arose. It is true that Eton had coaching anyway, for example. What we added beyond opening opposition is number one, competitive pricing means coaching academies are cheaper on their side of the house. What are their mechanisms for why competitive pricing does not exist? Number one, they say parents are very desperate and can be extorted. Two responses. One, parents are likely to look around and search for good coaching for their kids precisely due to OG's own mechanism that they are looking for Ivy League admissions for their students. This also means they will compare prices. Number two, there is often an asymmetry between coaches and parents, where especially in developing countries, parents are older and coaches have respect for them, and parental backlash makes coaching academies really scared, meaning they are likely to not overcharge parents. Number two, they say lots of academies collude. Number one, you can't collude across borders when there is a huge sharp spike in coaching academies. Collusion is more likely on their side of the house when there's a relatively smaller network of coaching academies. When there's many, the collective action problem means collusion is really hard. Number two, there are disincentives to collude, i.e. a game theoretic incentive where you know that if you don't collude and simply try to charge lower prices, there's a good chance you price your competitor out of the market. And basically you're stuck in a prisoner's dilemma where you keep lowering prices and you are unwilling to collude, especially when there are so many actors involved. Therefore, all that claims about a demographic divide are actually conditional on coaching being more expensive. Our claim is that coaching is cheaper. Opening opposition points out that Eton has coaching anyway. What opening opposition doesn't give you is the comparative, which is why we are actually able to ensure coaching is accessible for the vast majority of people. Number one, because we vastly increase competition. Number two, because coaching academies have to split costs across many more students, meaning their prices are low. This is also why David's extension is logically prior to CG, because we show you that debaters want to debate anyway, but parents aren't spending more and more money on their kids in order to give them coaching access, or they aren't shut out completely of the activity of debating unless they try to spend money on doing things like trying to improve themselves. Also, by the way, like doing debate helps with your resume by OG's own logic. So in the long term, it's often you gaining money, especially if you do debate in high school. So CG doesn't quite work. OG, yeah.
Even if judges get marginally more money, most do not make as much as Tim. There are a lot more people who lose in the world than rep speakers who gain, such as speakers who do struggle to pay rent because not all are rich, small comps who cannot get enough judges on the same day, and huge inequalities in the coaching market that's more expansive than just WSDC.
If we prove we are cheaper, we are logically prior to any of this, we didn't make an argument on judges. Second, they talk about the accessibility of competitions. Number one, David flips this. He explains that competitions become less expensive, i.e. the trend actually lowered the prices of competitions. The mechanism for this is that when for-profit debating arose, they had incentives to find innovative ways to cut costs heavily because they were competing against the clout of Oxford and Cambridge. Driving Oxford and Cambridge's clout down required them to charge low prices and find efficient ways to lower costs like Doxbot. What that does, by the way, is it also creates competitive pressure on Oxford and Cambridge to lower costs. And this is where we engage with the trend. Even prior to the increased commercialization of debating, Oxford and Cambridge charged a lot of money for debating, as did many local tournaments. If we prove that local tournaments become more accessible, we access all of opening governance impacts. Number two, you can still access non-profit competitions on our side. Judges and speakers want to be seen doing charity work. Non-profit tournaments, often lots of debaters from marginalized societies are actually really good and able to accumulate that even if they are not present in for-profit tournaments. And judges are able to judge at non-profit comps more if they have the insulation of getting money from a for-profit comp, which is more important as a mechanism than simply judges make more money. Therefore, competitions are often quite affordable, especially since they face competition as well. So for-profit competitions are affordable and they become more affordable on our side. Finally, comparing us to opening opposition. Number one, opening opposition makes the point about the persistence of online debating, and they agree that access to debating is crucial. What we do is we make a historical claim about the fact that the origin of widespread online debating depended on for-profit debating. This is more important than the persistence of online debating, because if online debating didn't emerge and become popular, then you access none of the impacts of persistence. Our claim is that during COVID-19, it is unlikely that debate would have happened, especially in developing circuits, because universities that host tournaments wouldn't gain large amounts of clout. University budgets are constrained when the costs of running a tournament are high, and debating societies themselves are less willing to organize online tournament because they choose to organize due to the things like the ability to network and use things like reg swaps to access in-person tournaments. Before this trend, these competitions didn't charge money they do now. CG says, someone will run a competition. but someone may not run a competition in a circuit where it's very hard to find someone to take the effort to run a competition, at the point where universities monopolize the notion of debating within these communities. What we get, therefore, is we create a strong incentive for universities to run tournaments, and we also give them the capacity to run tournaments through things like technological innovation and a proof of concept that it's possible to run an online tournament efficiently and make money out of it. What that means is we get more tournaments in developing circuits. This outweighs opening opposition's claims on getting funding to these university teams, because one, we prove that tournaments become cheaper, which is logically prior because that's what you need the funding for. And number two, you don't use the funding to run tournaments. That is something opening opposition had to prove prior to oppose.
I thank the opposition whip. I thank all the speakers for a great debate, and congratulations again for making the final. We're going to go judge now. Where do we judge? Do we have a breakout room? Do we go on Discord?